Growing up, I always thought my dad was my biggest champion. But one decision shattered that belief and my future along with it. My cousin Ethan was the golden boy of the family. Charismatic, ambitious, and the son my father seemed to wish he had. I had dreams of attending college, but when the time came, Dad handed my college fund to Ethan, saying, "He needs it more." That betrayal wasn't just financial, it was personal. As I watched my cousin live the life I was supposed to have, I vowed to uncover the truth behind my father's choice. What I found was darker than I could have ever imagined. When I was 9, my dad took me fishing at a quiet lake just outside our small Ohio town. We sat on the rickety dock, rods in hand, and watched the water ripple in the breeze. "Life's about taking care of your own, Dylan," he said, baiting his hook with practiced ease. "Family is everything. Always remember that." It became a family motto, one he repeated at barbecues, during holidays, and over countless dinners. I believed it then with the unwavering faith only a child could have. But as I grew older, I began to see cracks in that mantra. Family didn't mean all of us, it meant Ethan. Ethan, my cousin, was my dad's pride and joy. He was everything I wasn't. Charming, confident, and endlessly ambitious. Where I was reserved, he was the life of every party. Where I excelled in quiet pursuits like academics, Ethan dominated in sports and social circles. At every family gathering, Dad's eyes would light up when Ethan walked in. "Look at that kid," he'd say, nudging me. "A real go-getter." And for years, I told myself it didn't matter. Ethan and I were different, and that was okay. It wasn't a competition. But deep down, it still stung. The letter from NYU arrived in early April, in a crisp white envelope bearing the university's logo. I tore it open in the kitchen while Mom cooked dinner, my hands trembling. "Congratulations," it read. "We are pleased to offer you admission." "Mom!" I shouted, running into the living room where she was folding laundry. I got in. Full ride. Her face lit up, and for once, I felt like I was flying. "Oh, Dylan," she said, pulling me into a hug. "I'm so proud of you." When Dad came home from work that night, I showed him the letter, expecting the same excitement. Instead, he gave a non-committal grunt and muttered, "Good for you, kid." His lukewarm response deflated me, but I brushed it off. Maybe he was just tired. But then, 3 weeks later, the other shoe dropped. It was a Sunday afternoon, and Ethan had come over for lunch. Mom made her famous pot roast, and Dad cracked open a few beers with Ethan while I sat quietly, picking at my food. "Ethan's got big plans," Dad announced halfway through the meal. "Business school down in Chicago. Top-tier program." "That's great," I said, forcing a smile. "Problem is," Dad continued, "it's expensive. Real expensive." I froze, the fork halfway to my mouth. A knot formed in my stomach as I realized where this conversation was heading. "We've decided to help him out," Dad said, his tone casual, as if he were discussing the weather. "Your mom and I agreed it's the right thing to do." "What do you mean, help him out?" I asked slowly. Dad leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "We're going to use the college fund to cover his tuition." My heart stopped. "What college fund?" "The one we've been saving for years," he said, as if it were obvious. The room seemed to tilt, my head spinning. "That money's for me," I said, my voice rising. "It's for family," Dad shot back, his tone hardening. "And Ethan needs it more than you do. You got a scholarship, didn't you?" "That doesn't cover everything," I snapped. "And what about my future? I worked for this, Dad." "You'll figure it out," he said dismissively. "You're smart, Dylan. You'll manage." I turned to Ethan, who was staring at his plate, avoiding my gaze. "Did you know about this?" I demanded. He raised his hands defensively. "This wasn't my idea, man. I swear." But his words meant nothing. The betrayal was already complete. I left the house that night without a plan, walking aimlessly through the dark streets of our neighborhood. The cool night air did little to soothe the fire raging in my chest. My father had chosen Ethan again. I ended up at a park a few blocks away, collapsing onto a bench beneath a flickering street lamp. The anger gave way to a hollow ache, one I didn't know how to fill. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text from Mom. "Come home. We can talk about this." But I didn't want to talk. I wanted answers. Over the next few weeks, the tension in our house became unbearable. I couldn't look at Dad without feeling the sting of his decision. Mom tried to mediate, but her efforts were futile. "Your father's just trying to do what's best for everyone," she said one evening as she folded laundry in my room. "No," I said bitterly. "He's trying to do what's best for Ethan. He always has." She sighed, sitting on the edge of my bed. "It's not that simple, Dylan." "Then explain it to me," I snapped. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment I thought she might. But then she shook her head. "It's complicated." "Yeah," I muttered. "That's what I thought." Ethan tried to talk to me once, showing up unannounced at the library where I worked part-time. "Hey," he said, sliding into the chair across from me. I glared at him. "What do you want?" I wanted to say I'm sorry," he said, his voice soft. "I didn't ask for this, Dylan. I know it's not fair." "No, it's not," I said coldly. "I didn't know they were going to do this," he continued. "And for what it's worth, I don't want to take your future away." "Then don't," I said simply. He looked away, guilt etched across his face. "It's not that easy." "Why not?" I demanded. "You've always had everything handed to you, Ethan. Maybe it's time you stood on your own for once." His jaw tightened, and for a moment I thought he might argue. But then he just stood up, his shoulders slumping. "I wish it were that simple." As he walked away, I felt a flicker of satisfaction. But it was quickly overshadowed by something else, something heavier. The turning point came 2 months later during a family barbecue. I was in the garage, grabbing more soda for the cooler, when I overheard Dad on the phone. "I told you I'll figure it out," he was saying, his voice low and tense. "Just give me a little more time." There was a pause, and then, "No, he doesn't know. And he's not going to." My stomach dropped. Who was he talking to? And what didn't I know? I crept closer, straining to hear. "I'll take care of it," Dad said firmly. "I promised Ethan I'd fix this, and I will." "Fix what?" The questions buzzed in my mind as I returned to the backyard. The drinks forgotten. Something was wrong, something bigger than I'd realized. And if Dad wasn't going to tell me, I'd have to find out for myself. It didn't take long to piece together the basics of what Dad was hiding. The calls, the tension in his voice, the way he avoided eye contact whenever I brought up the college fund. All of it pointed to one conclusion. Ethan was in trouble. Big trouble. I wasn't sure what kind of trouble yet, but I knew it was more than tuition fees and a fancy business degree. And the fact that Dad was trying to handle it himself, while lying to everyone else, only made it worse. The question was, how deep did this go? My chance to dig deeper came sooner than I expected. A week after the barbecue, Ethan came over for dinner. Dad had been unusually quiet all evening, barely touching his food, while Ethan acted like everything was fine. I waited until he stepped outside for a cigarette before following him. The summer air was thick and humid, and the faint glow of fireflies blinked in the bushes. "Enjoying the free meal?" I asked, leaning against the porch railing. Ethan flinched, caught off guard. "What's your problem, man?" "You, and whatever mess you've dragged Dad into." He tensed, his cigarette halfway to his lips. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't play dumb," I snapped. "I heard him on the phone. He's covering for you, isn't he?" Ethan's jaw tightened, his eyes darting toward the house. "This isn't any of your business, Dylan." "Yeah, it is," I shot back. "Because he's using my college fund to bail you out. So why don't you tell me what's going on before I find out myself?" For a moment I thought he might actually tell me, but then he shook his head, flicking his cigarette into the yard. "Stay out of it." And with that he walked back inside, leaving me fuming on the porch. I wasn't going to let him stonewall me. If Ethan wouldn't talk, I'd just have to find the answers on my own. That night, I waited until everyone was asleep before sneaking into Dad's office. The room smelled faintly of old books and coffee, the moonlight casting pale streaks across the cluttered desk. I started with the drawers, sifting through folders and receipts. Most of it was boring. Utility bills, tax documents, but then I found something tucked beneath a stack of envelopes. A folded piece of paper with Ethan's name scrawled across the top. The contents made my stomach drop. It was a payment schedule, a long list of debts owed to various names and accounts. Some were official banks, but others looked shadier. Names like Big Al and Lakeside Lending stood out like neon signs. Gambling. I sank into the desk chair, the weight of the discovery pressing down on me. Ethan wasn't just in trouble, he was in over his head. And Dad was trying to fix it, no matter what it cost. The next morning, I decided I'd had enough. This time, I wasn't going to tiptoe around the issue. I cornered Dad in the kitchen while Mom was out grocery shopping, slamming the payment schedule down on the table. "What the hell is this?" He froze, his face pale. "Where did you get that? Does it matter?" I snapped. "You've been lying to me, to all of us. This is why you gave Ethan my college fund, isn't it? To pay off his gambling debts." Dad sighed, rubbing his temples. "It's not that simple, Dylan." "Oh, really? Because it looks pretty simple to me. He gambles, he loses, and you swoop in to save him. At my expense." "It's more complicated than that," he said quietly. "Ethan made some bad choices, but he's family. We don't turn our backs on family. Even when they screw us over?" I shot back. "How far does this go, Dad? Are you planning to cover for him forever?" "He's trying to change," Dad said, his voice strained. "He just needs time." "And how much more is that going to cost us?" He didn't answer. Instead, he stared down at the table, his shoulders slumping under the weight of his guilt. For the first time, I saw him not as the strong, infallible father I'd grown up with, but as a man drowning in his own mistakes. I didn't speak to Ethan for days after that. Every time I saw his name pop up on my phone, I ignored it. But then, one night, he showed up at my apartment. "You can't keep shutting me out," he said as I opened the door. "Watch me," I replied, crossing my arms. "Look, I know you're mad," he said, stepping inside uninvited. "But I didn't ask for this, okay? Dad's the one who decided to get involved. Because you couldn't clean up your own mess?" I shot back. Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You think I wanted this? You think I like being the screw-up? Then why do you keep doing it?" For once, he didn't have a snarky comeback. Instead, he sank onto my couch, his head in his hands. "Because I don't know how to stop," he admitted. "I've been gambling since college. It started small, just a few games here and there. But then it got out of control." "Clearly," I said, my tone sharp. He looked up at me, his eyes hollow. "You don't get it, Dylan. It's not just about the money. It's the rush, the feeling of winning. It's like nothing else matters in that moment." "And what about the losing?" I asked. "What does that feel like?" "Like hell," he said softly. "Like you'd do anything to make it go away." For the first time, I saw a crack in Ethan's armor, a glimpse of the person beneath the bravado. And as much as I wanted to hate him, a small part of me couldn't help but feel sorry for him. But sympathy only went so far, because 2 weeks later, things took a darker turn. I came home from work one evening to find a man waiting outside my apartment building. He was tall and broad, with a face like a bulldog and a gold chain glinting against his chest. "Dylan Callahan?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. "Who's asking?" I replied, keeping my distance. "Let's just say I'm a friend of Ethan's," he said, taking a step closer. "And I'm here to remind you that family debts don't go away." My blood ran cold. "I'm not part of this," he smirked. "You are now." Without another word, he handed me a card with a number scrawled on it, then turned and walked away. I stood there, the card trembling in my hand. Whatever mess Ethan had gotten himself into, it wasn't just his problem anymore. It was mine too. The man's visit to my apartment wasn't just a warning. It was a declaration. Ethan's mistakes weren't just his burden anymore. They were dragging me, my father, and potentially our entire family into his abyss. That night, I sat in the darkened living room, staring at the card the man had left. The number was handwritten, scrawled with a casual arrogance that made my skin crawl. Every instinct told me to stay out of it, to let Ethan face the consequences of his actions. But then I thought of Dad, of how the stress of shielding Ethan was eating away at him. I thought of my mom, who was caught in the crossfire without even knowing it. And I thought of the man's parting words, "You're family now." This wasn't going to go away. The next morning I called the number. It rang twice before a man's voice answered, deep and impatient. "Yeah, this is Dylan Callahan," I said, my mouth dry. "I need to talk about Ethan's debt." There was a long pause. Then, "Smart kid, you're saving us a trip." We arranged a meeting at a diner on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where no one asked questions. I arrived early, my stomach churning as I nursed a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. The man who walked in was different from the one who had visited my apartment. He was older, with silver hair and an expensive suit that contrasted sharply with the shabby surroundings. "You must be Dylan," he said, sliding into the booth across from me. "And you're the guy who's been threatening my family?" I replied, my voice steady despite the fear coiled in my chest. He chuckled. "Let's call it motivation. What do you want?" "Ethan owes us $80,000, he said bluntly. "With interest, it's closer to $100,000 now. We're not a charity, kid. We expect payment." I clenched my fists beneath the table. "And if I don't have that kind of money? Then we take what we're owed another way," he said smoothly. "Starting with your father's assets. That house of his looks like it could fetch a decent price." My heart pounded. "You can't do that." "Oh, I can," he said, leaning forward. "But I'm a reasonable man. You've got 2 weeks to come up with $50,000. Pay that, and we'll consider the rest forgiven." 2 weeks, I repeated, my voice rising. "Take it or leave it," he said, standing. "But if you leave it, don't expect us to be so polite next time. The price of family. $50,000 in 2 weeks. It was an impossible number, but I had no choice. If I didn't find a way, Dad would lose everything, and Ethan might lose more than that. I spent the next few days scraping together everything I could. I drained my savings, sold my car, and took on every overtime shift my boss would give me. I even swallowed my pride and asked Mom for help, spinning a story about unexpected expenses. She handed me a check without question, her love and trust cutting deeper than any guilt trip could. But it still wasn't enough. On the 10th day, I found Ethan at a bar downtown. He was nursing a drink, his posture slumped and defeated. "You look like hell," I said, sliding into the seat beside him. He didn't look up. "What do you want?" "I want you to grow a spine," I snapped. "Do you have any idea what I've been doing for the past week? Selling everything I own. Begging for scraps, just to clean up your mess." "I didn't ask you to," he muttered. "No, but you sure as hell let me," I shot back. "You think Dad's guilt is going to save you forever? You think I'm going to save you forever?" Ethan finally looked at me, his eyes bloodshot and hollow. "I never wanted this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen." "Then do something about it," I said, my tone hard. "Take responsibility for once in your life." His shoulders sagged, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something new in his eyes. Shame, maybe. Or resolve. "What do you want me to do?" he asked. The answer came 2 days later, in the form of a meeting Ethan set up with one of his friends, a bookie named Marco who had connections to the loan sharks. "If you're serious about paying off this debt," Marco said, his tone skeptical, "there's one way to do it fast." I didn't like the way he said it, but I nodded for him to continue. "There's a poker game in Chicago this weekend," he said. "High stakes, big rewards. You've got enough cash to buy in, and if you play smart, you might just walk out with what you need." "And if I lose?" Marco shrugged. "Then you're no worse off than you are now." It was a terrible idea. Reckless. Dangerous. But it was also my best shot. The poker game was held in the back room of a dimly lit club, the air thick with smoke and tension. Ethan came with me, his presence a strange mix of comfort and pressure. "You sure about this?" he asked as I sat down at the table. "No," I admitted, "but I'm doing it anyway." The game was a blur of cards, chips, and calculated risks. My heart pounded with every hand, my palms slick with sweat. For hours, I hovered on the edge of disaster, the weight of everything riding on my decisions. And then, against all odds, I won. It wasn't enough to cover the full debt, but it was enough to meet the loan shark's demand. As I walked out of the club, clutching the cash like a lifeline, I felt a strange mix of triumph and exhaustion. The payment bought us freedom, at least for now. The loan sharks were satisfied, and the immediate danger was gone. But the scars remained. Ethan started therapy, finally taking steps to address the addiction that had nearly destroyed him. Dad and I had a long, painful conversation about trust, guilt, and the damage his favoritism had caused. As for me, I left Ohio that fall, enrolling at a smaller college with the little money I had left. It wasn't NYU, but it was a fresh start, a chance to build a future on my own terms. I still call home sometimes, though the conversations are awkward and stilted. Forgiveness is a work in progress, but I'm learning to let go. Because sometimes, the only way to save yourself is to break free from the people who hold you back, even if they're family.